Welcome as we continue in our series on the Second Commandment in Law, Gospel, and Prophecy. This is the second of three parts dealing with God's law in the Old Testament. Today's presentation will be on the moral, civil, and ceremonial law. Before we begin, let us pause for a word of prayer. Lord, we ask your presence to be with us, to teach us, to guide us, to mold us, to shape us, so that we can walk according to your will. Amen. We learned last time that there is a controversy over the law that Christians have been embroiled in for centuries, and this is a debate that concerns the continuing authority and applicability of the law of Moses, including the Ten Commandments for Christians. And we learned last time, as we started to look at this topic, we did a word study and we looked at 4 Hebrew words for law. We learned that the first of these words, Torah, is best seen as an umbrella term, as a broad umbrella that captures all of the dimensions of God's law as written about in the books of Moses. Then there were more specific terms that we learned involve some overlap in terms of how they refer to various aspects of God's law, especially the moral aspects. 2 of these words were mishpat and hokwa or hok, both of which can refer to civil and ceremonial laws as well as moral regulations. There was one term, however, mitzvah, that stood out because of its singularity of use. This particular term was used only to refer to moral standards which were tied to God's authority over and his relationship to his people. And this included not just simply the Ten Commandment law, but also those moral principles that form the foundation for civil and ceremonial regulations. And we represented our word study through a diagram. And we saw how the first 3 terms, Torah, Hokwa or Hok, and Mishpat, they cover the moral, civil, and ceremonial law, whereas mitzvah only falls under the moral law. We conducted our word study just assuming that you understood what we meant by moral, civil, and ceremonial law. Today, we're going to take up that topic more directly. And the central question for today is, does the Bible support a distinction between these 3 categories of Old Testament law? And if so, on what basis does it distinguish between them? And with what benefits and drawbacks does it do so? And so the key point that we're going to be focusing on today is the same as for the last presentation, and that is due to necessary, unavoidable overlap between the categories and terminology of Old Testament law. The usual distinction that we make between moral, civil, and ceremonial laws, although still valid and meaningful, is not as clear-cut as most people suppose. And by the time we finish our study today and next time, we're going to learn that it's actually a good thing that it's not as clear-cut that as many people suppose it to be. Now, to take up our study for this presentation, we are going to have to deal with some theology. Now, I know that at the very mention of the word theology, some people are just taken aback. They cringe because for many people, just mere mention of theology and theologians raises a sense of skepticism. They wonder, can they be trusted? Are they even really necessary? Well, as with all things, we need to have a balanced perspective of what we're dealing with. So let's start off by just clarifying what exactly theology is. Theology is just really the systematic study of things related to God, his nature, his character, his activities. So it's a systematic study of the nature of God and also of religious belief, practice, and experience. So that's just a broad definition of what theology is. So nothing wrong in and of that in and of itself. Now, as you might not realize, the Bible is actually full of theology, particularly the New Testament is full of theological writing and teaching and arguments. Just a few examples. Paul, when he wrote to the Romans, to the Thessalonians, to the Corinthians, the Galatians, and the other letters that he wrote, those letters contain a lot of theological discussion, a lot of theological discourse. Jesus himself also engaged in theology. For instance, when he taught the multitudes on the Sermon on the Mount is one example. His conversation with Nicodemus that night when he taught him about the Holy Spirit, the conversations that Jesus had as he walked along the roadsides with his disciples were largely theological at times. The beloved disciple, John, writing in his gospel, is full of theological discussion, as well as his pastoral letters, particularly the book of First John. It's just one long theological discourse on the love of God and the implications of that love. So theology is part of the Bible. You can't separate the two. But on the other hand, we do have to recognize that Jesus was not always in agreement with. As a matter of fact, at times he outright condemned the theologians of his day. And it's important for us to understand why he did so. And it can be boiled down to two basic reasons. The first is that theology can be based on anything, including the Bible, but it also can be based on anything besides the Bible. What are some examples that you can base a theology on? You can base theology on philosophy, on tradition, on pop culture. You can base theology on some film that you saw. You'll be surprised how many people do that. You can base it on other religions or religious books. You can base it on mysticism, on speculation. You can base it on anything. In ancient Greek, there were a group of people called the Pythagoreans who based their theology on math. So theology is not always based on the Bible. And for Jesus, that was a problem. And we find an example of that in Mark chapter 7, verses 7 through 13. I just summarize it here, but I encourage you to read the whole thing. Jesus said, speaking of the religious teachers and leaders of his day, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men, their own speculations and ideas. And he went on to say, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down. So that was one problem that Jesus had with theologians of his day. They were basing their theology on things other than the Bible. And that largely included Greek philosophy in addition to the rabbinical traditions. A second problem that Jesus had with the theologians of his day is that theology can be based on misinterpretations of the Bible. So it's not enough for someone to say, oh, I base my beliefs on the Bible, but it has to be the Bible correctly understood. once again, the Bible makes this clear. Jesus, speaking in Matthew 22:29, answered them and said to them, and this is to the Sadducees this time, you are mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. There are many people who think they understand the Bible, but they have it all twisted up. And Paul warned Timothy of the same danger, just using a positive admonition in Second Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, where he encouraged him to be diligent, to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So if there's a right way to interpret the Bible, then that definitely implies that there are also wrong ways to do it. So those were the two basic reasons why Jesus condemned theologians of his day. So as we go through these presentations, we laid out from the very beginning that we are following the method that Jesus and the apostles used to interpret the Bible, which begins with allowing the Bible to explain itself. So with much prayer and humility, we're trusting that God will guide us through these studies into correct understandings of his word. So we need not fear taking up some theology in order to gain understanding of the topics that we're dealing with. So we're focusing on what is known as the categories of law model of Old Testament law. This is a model that seeks to take the laws of the Old Testament and divide them into three categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. Now, contrary to what many people think, these categories of Old Testament law are not found directly, explicitly in the Bible. Instead, they originated in the theology and religious thought of the Protestant Reformation of the 15, 16, and 1700s. And the distinctions between moral, civil, and ceremonial law can be traced back to several sources from this time period, such as John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, which were published in 1536, as well as the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was first written in 1646, and which many evangelical Protestants still ascribe to today. And according to chapter 19 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, the law of God can be divided into three parts. The first is moral law. This confession of faith defined the moral law as the law that was spoken by the Lord on Sinai and written by him on the 2 stone tablets. And it goes on to say that because these commandments express our duty to God as well as our duty to one another, that they continue to apply with universal force, that there is no time or place where these precepts and principles do not apply to the human race. And one verse that of many that is offered as biblical evidence comes from James chapter 1, verse 25, which we looked at in our last study. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. So they understood that this perfect law of liberty represents the 10 Commandment law, and that everyone, including Christians, are encouraged to continue in it. And by doing so, that they will earn a blessing. The second category of law that was recognized in the Westminster Confession of Faith was ceremonial law. And this was defined as those laws which regulated the worship rituals and provided moral instructions to ancient Israel as a religious community. Now, because these regulations, it goes on to explain, were types, they prefigured Christ and his atoning work. So, because they pointed forward to an antitype, a greater reality, once the new covenant was established, once Christ came and died once and for all as a sacrifice for sin, and now that he is in heaven ministering as our high priest, these regulations are no longer needed and they cease to apply under the new covenant. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 is one of several verses that are offered in support of this notion of ceremonial law. From the English Standard Version, it reads, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near." So it's clear from the context that the law that's being talked about is the law that involves offering sacrifices, these ceremonial laws. And it clearly states that these ceremonial laws pointed that they were a shadow of a greater reality, and that greater reality is found in Christ. So we have the moral law, we have the ceremonial law, then there was the civil law. The confession explains or defines the civil law as being those laws which govern the affairs and relations of the ancient Israels as members of a theocratic state, as members of a theocratic nation, one that is that operates under the leadership and authority of God himself. So when Israel ceased to exist as a political body ruled by the Lord, these statutes ceased to apply with legal force. Now notice that that this applied when Israel existed as a nation ruled by the Lord, not as a normal political nation such as every other country that exists today. So these statutes ceased to apply when Israel ceased to be a theocracy. And although they no longer apply with legal force, they still may provide direction and guidance on valuable moral principles. And the same is true of the ceremonial law, as we find out. Although it no longer applies to anyone today with legal force, that's not to say that there's not some value to be gained from studying and learning about them. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10 provides some insight into the status of civil law. It says the scepter. Remember that a scepter is a symbol of rulership, of political authority. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah, representing Israel at large, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And to him, talking about Shiloh, who is just simply is a prefiguring Christ, to him shall be the obedience of the people. So once Christ came, the scepter would no longer exist within Judah. It would depart from Judah, and no longer would they possess authority as a nation ruled and governed by the Lord, because Christ is going to come and he's going to put in place something that is much broader, much longer lasting. He is the true Davidic king, and the kingdom that he establishes will reign forever and ever. So these three categories of law, moral, ceremonial, and civil, were first recognized by the Protestant reformers. So what should we make of this? How can we make sense of the fact that it was so late in the history of Christianity that this notion of the categories of law was created? Well, once again, we need to be balanced in our view and need to understand that just because something is not explicitly stated in the Bible does not automatically make it scripturally invalid. There are a number of theological concepts and frameworks that we find in concept in the Bible, though not by name. So for instance, the Trinity, we find the concept there, even though you won't find the word. Nativity is definitely, we find that talked about in the Bible, but we don't find that term. Millennium just simply means 1,000 years. You could search from back to front. You won't find that word millennium in the Bible. Neither will you find the word Bible in the Bible. But that does not mean that these are invalid concepts. But when we don't find something explicitly stated in the Bible, it does challenge us to look closely at it, to examine the scriptural support for it. And that's what we have to do in this case. So it raises the question, does the Bible support the moral civil ceremonial law model despite its late historical roots? And as we're going to find out, the answer is yes. However, So, what are some of the biblical supports for the categories of law? Well, first of all, there's clear biblical evidence that the Mosaic laws do fulfill the various roles and functions represented by the moral, civil, and ceremonial law. We saw that in our last presentation when we went through our word study. We were able to very easily see that the different words for law are connected to these various categories of law. So they're actually describing something that is really there. There's also evidence, clear evidence, that the ceremonial and legal laws were tied to institutions unique to Old Testament Israel. In the case of the ceremonial law, they were tied to the Hebrew tabernacle and temple-based worship system. We know that the tabernacle was eventually replaced by the temple in Jerusalem, but they both operated based on the same system of rituals. And so the ceremonial laws were connected to that ancient Hebrew institution. And the civil law was connected, as we just discussed, to the theocratic system of government that existed in ancient Israel. So they were tied to institutions which no longer exist in today's world. So there's clear evidence, of scriptural evidence of that. There's also clear scriptural evidence that the Pentateuch, which are the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, places a priority on the 10 Commandments, that the 10 Commandments are seen as being on a different level. We're going to look at evidence of this in our next presentation. And it's also clear in the New Testament that the writers and teachers support the notion that while all divine laws are authoritative, some still hold greater importance than others. And one example can be found in Matthew 23:23, where Jesus referred to the weightier matters of the law, which include justice and mercy and faith. And he plainly said, these you ought to have done, speaking about these weightier matters of law, without leaving the other matters undone. And here, in this particular instance, he was speaking to the laws of tithing, about how the Pharisees were so punctilious about tithing and washing dishes and these other ceremonial things, Jesus didn't necessarily condemn those other laws, but he's saying, look, there's other things that are more important that you ought to be doing as well. So all four of these points speak strongly in support of these categories of law. But that does not mean that there has not been occasion for criticism of this model. And one such theologian who criticized these categories of law was J. Daniel Hayes, who wrote an article that was published in 2001, where he criticized the categories of law as being arbitrary. And he offered two reasons for why he felt that way. The first was that he pointed out that laws that supposedly belong to different categories are often just mingled together and mixed together without any rhyme or reason, it seems. And one clear example of what he's talking about can be found in Leviticus chapter 19, where you find moral laws, civil laws, ceremonial laws, really just all intermingled together. And he says, well, look, it doesn't make much sense to try to take these and separate these out into different categories. You're just being, as he said, arbitrary. And another argument he made is that there are many laws that don't fit into one category. And one clear example of this are the Sabbath laws. The Sabbath laws weren't just moral. The Sabbath laws also can be found in the ceremonial regulations. There are Sabbath laws that can be found in the civil regulations. So he argued, well, how can you say that this is supposed to fit into a particular category when it falls into all of them? So what are we to make of Hayes's criticisms? Well, there's two broad responses that we can offer to them. And the first of these focuses on a key assumption that he makes. So in order to understand that, we first need to understand the difference between two types of categories. So we need to use a little bit of logic here. There are what we can call mutually exclusive categories, and then there are collectively exhaustive categories. So what's the difference between the two? By mutually exclusive, we mean that these are categories that require an item to be placed in only one category. And it doesn't matter if the available categories represent all of the possibilities or not. It only matters that that item can be placed in only one category. So that's what we mean by mutually exclusive. Collectively exhaustive categories requires that an item falls into at least one of many categories which do represent all of the possibilities. So notice that with collectively exhaustive categories, an item has to fall into at least one category, but it can be placed into more than one categories. In theory, it can be placed in all of the categories as long as the categories represent all of the possibilities that are available. So let's look at the distinction between these two types of categories with a visual example. So say that we have three circles, circle 1, circle 2, and circle 3. And each of these circles represents a different category. If these three categories were mutually exclusive, then we would need to arrange our circles in a way that is similar to what is on the left, where there is no overlap, no contact between the three circles. Circle 1 is completely separate from 2, and 2 is separate from 3, and likewise. And under this type of scheme, an item can only be placed in only one of those circles at a time. So that is mutually exclusive. Collectively exhaustive, however, would be a situation where circle 1, circle 2, and circle 3 all overlap one another. So that, yes, it is possible to place an item only in circle 1, but you can also place it in more than just circle 1. You can place it in the area of overlap between circle 1 and circle 3. As a matter of fact, you could place it in the area of overlap between circles 1, 2, and 3. So with collectively exhaustive categories, it's possible for something to fit into more than one category, and that's okay. So the question that we need to ask is, are these categories of Old Testament law meant to be mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive? Now, Hayes assumes, as well as most other people, when they look at these categories of law, they assume that they are mutually exclusive, that an Old Testament law only fits into one and only one of these categories. However, Roy Gain, another theologian who wrote in his book, Old Testament Law for Christians, recognized that that assumption is flawed. And he wrote about it when he wrote concerning Hayes's view that it is a simplistic attempt to place each Old Testament law as a whole in one category that is either applicable, moral law, or not applicable, civil and ceremonial law to Christians. Gain argued that, look, you can't do that, that these categories of law are not mutually exclusive. Instead, they are collectively exhaustive, so that a law is allowed to be placed into more than one category. Not only is it allowed, but it makes sense to do so when we look at the scriptural evidence. First of all, collectively exhaustive categories fit better with the Hebrew holistic mindset that we see all throughout the Bible. An example of this holistic mindset is the view of human nature that we find in the Bible, that the human being, or the human soul, as it's referred to in the Bible, is the complete person, not just some part of a person that can go floating off somewhere after death. No, the person is a whole. It must exist as a whole. That's an example of the Hebrew holistic mindset, and it's that same mindset that's taken toward law in the Old Testament. Also, we see clear examples of how these Old Testament laws do in fact fit into multiple categories. And so it just fits better with the biblical evidence. So we have to reject that understanding of these categories as being mutually exclusive and understand that they are collectively exhaustive, that you are allowed to place a law into more than one of these categories. Building on this understanding, Hayes offers yet another response to Hayes's criticism. Gain argues that, in a sense, all Old Testament laws were moral in that they had to be observed, they had to be kept. And he goes on to argue that once we set aside this idea that the categories of law have to be mutually exclusive, that we can revise what they mean. We can revise their definition. So Gain proposes that moral law be understood to refer to any type of universal continuing principle, whether it is stated directly, such as in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, or whether it underlies laws that apply to limited situations, such as the civil and ceremonial laws, the moral principles underlying them. So that is what moral law means from Gain's perspective. And civil and ceremonial law, He views those as describing certain limiting circumstances or factors on the moral law that links it to the functioning of those uniquely Hebrew institutions, such as the tabernacle and the temple with ceremonial law, and the theocratic government with the civil law. This is how Gain proposes that these categories of law be understood. So, what should we make of Gain's response to Hayes's criticism? Well, first of all, let's look visually at how we can represent Gain's understanding of the categories of law. First of all, moral, civil, ceremonial law, he recognizes falls under the law of God. But he also recognizes that there is a distinction between the moral law, the civil law, and the ceremonial law. And he argues that this moral law continues to apply today. However, the moral law includes more than the 10 Commandments in his perspective. The moral law also includes any type of moral principle that underlies the civil law and the ceremonial law. So the moral law is, it's a separate category, but it also provides a foundation for the other two categories of law. So, what can we make of Gain's revisions to the categories of law? First of all, we need to recognize that there are some benefits to this view. It definitely provides biblical support for the three customary categories of Old Testament law: moral, civil, and ceremonial. And it also shows why and how some parts of the law continue to apply today to Christians while others don't. This view also removes that problematic hidden assumption that the categories of law are mutually exclusive categories. And it recognizes a need to revise these categories so that they can be understood and applied with greater clarity. But there's also some drawbacks to Gain's view. The first is that by revising these categories, it strays away from the normal, commonly understood meaning that is assigned to these categories. So, for example, when most people refer to the moral law, they have the understanding that was expressed in the Westminster Confession of Faith. They're talking about the statutes that were spoken and written by the Lord on Sinai, the 10 Commandment law. They're not talking about moral statements or principles that Moses wrote about and that Gain proposes to be included with the moral law. So he has the way he uses the term is different from the way that most people use and understand that term moral law. His view also is more complicated to apply to the categories of law, because in one sense the moral law is a separate category, but in another way is not quite a separate category. It's complicated, and Gaines, he admits that. There's also a need to consider a broader range of criteria for defining these categories. There are some criteria that are normally taken into account that Gain excludes. And in our next presentation, I'm going to argue that those criteria need to be brought back into the mix, that they need to be factored in. It also has a tendency to shift our attention away from the categories of law model toward other methods for applying Old Testament law to Christians, which is not necessarily bad in and of itself, but we want to stay focused on the applicability of these categories of law. And then finally, it runs the risk of downplaying the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, in favor of placing greater focus on other seemingly broader moral principles. So, for instance, it's not uncommon for those who hold views similar to Gaines to you hear them speaking a lot about justice. Well, I wonder, how do you define justice in a biblical sense without having to trace back and rely on the Ten Commandment law? Can you define justice in some way that does not rely in a heavy and fundamental way on the precepts of the Ten Commandments? That's not always clear. So there's benefits and there's drawbacks. So what can we conclude from our study today? Well, we can conclude that, first of all, though the categories of law model originated late in church history, it does reflect biblically valid distinctions between moral statutes, which continued to apply to Christians, and civil and ceremonial statutes, which were tied to unique institutions in ancient Israel and which do not apply with legal force to Christians today. But we can also see that the categories of law model, as proposed by the Protestant reformers, though valid and useful, it was not perfect, and it does require some revisions in order to apply that framework with greater clarity and consistency. So in our next discussion, we're going to take another look at these categories of law and see how they compare to what we are going to define as principal and ancillary laws. And we're going to find that by doing so, we're going to bring clarity, greater clarity to these categories of law, which will help us to better understand the role of all of the commandments, including the second commandment, in the life and experience of believers today. So I look forward to being able to spend time again with you in our next presentation. I want to continue to encourage you to study and to pray and to seek to learn and follow God's will for your life. I encourage you to contact us at our email, havertownprophecy@gmail.com, with any questions, and just keep a lookout for our soon coming Facebook page. Until next time, take care.